New World has some intriguing classless system where basically your weapon defines your class and your role as well to a lesser extent. Today, we're going to go through the 3 traditional roles of an MMORPG, tank, DPS, and healer, and how they apply to New World. Let's go. This video is sponsored by my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/NorZZa, where I will be streaming a lot of New World when the game does come out. So if you have any questions about this video or any of my other content, please jump over there and check me out. I stream every Tuesday and Thursday Australian night times. Hope to see you guys there in the next stream. Now, let's go. I'm going to save DPS for last as it's the most complicated and interesting in my opinion, but as always, timestamps in the description down below if you want to skip straight to the DPS. Now, the main thing here is that regardless of your role, you should be leveling your main weapon, whatever that is, whether it's a tank weapon, a healing weapon, or a DPS weapon, throughout your questing experience. Because once you do hit some of the PvE dungeons and that kind of content, you want to have as much points into the weapon mastery as possible, as most of your abilities and damage and passives all come from that weapon mastery. So the higher your skill level with the weapon, the more damage or healing or tank output you will have. So let's get into tank. Now, tank, the attribute you want to focus on here is Constitution. How to tank in New World is not rightly obvious from the start. Some of the abilities mention taunting and seem to be tank focused, but you do need a particular gem to be slotted into your weapons to enable those tanking features, and that's the Carnelian gem. There are different versions of this gem, but primarily you can find this gem by looting chests, and you get a flawed version. You will maybe have to cut it yourself, although if you do go to a trading post, you can just buy a cut gem and slot it into a weapon. You do have to have a open slot in that weapon in order to slot it. What this will do is increase your threat generation with that weapon just by using your auto attacks with the weapon, as well as adding effects to particular abilities. If you read some of the ability descriptions, it will say if the gem is slotted, it will add a taunt effect to that weapon on top of what it already does. Now, for the most part, the tanking weapon you will need is the sword and shield and the defender line in this skill tree. Shield bash and defiant stance are the 2 tanking abilities primarily, as they do have the taunt feature. I personally use one of the DPS sword and shield abilities as my third ability, as the third defender one doesn't have a taunt. Your secondary weapon as a tank is up to you, and there are some really good options, and it really depends on how you want to play. All of the weapons that you can put in your secondary for a tank perspective will have one ability that is a taunt, so you should always make sure you have that ability slotted, whatever it may be. You could go the Great Axe, which you can use to pull enemies closer to you. It also does a decent amount of DPS. A hammer is a really good option for stuns. It's what I personally use, as it does have a really good shockwave AoE that does stun as well as taunt once you do have the gem slotted. And the hatchet is good for some self-sustain if you do want to keep yourself up without having to rely on a healer as much. And let's move on to a healer. Now, as a healer, your key focus as an attribute should be focus, so make sure you're focusing on focus. That makes sense? Okay. Healing in New World is much more direct. You don't need a secret gem to be slotted or anything. Basically, all you need is a life staff, and you can spec into either the healing or the protector lines within this weapon mastery. Primarily the healing line, as obviously it does healing, but the protector line will give other buffs to your allies. Secondary weapon is up to you, and for the most part, throughout dungeoning and PvE content in a group, you won't switch away from the life staff, because as the life staff, it does heal your allies, and in the same attack or your light attacks, it will damage enemies as well. So you don't necessarily need to switch to a secondary weapon, and I also wouldn't advise it because of the delay when you are switching weapons. If you do switch to a DPS weapon, someone desperately needs healing, you have to switch back. You don't want to be missing out on critical heal moments and have one of your allies die. In the open world though, you absolutely can use a secondary weapon, and it is really up to you. I would personally suggest to choose something on the intelligence scaling line, as most of the gear will buff focus and intelligence together that you find, so it may just have a better damage output without too much extra work if you do pick something from this line. If you want to go something melee, you could pick the rapier, as it does scale with intelligence, although there's like the fire staff, the ice gauntlet, and the musket that you could also pick in this line. As a side note, when you are leveling and questing, you should be using the life staff as mentioned earlier for the weapon masteries, and making sure that you have at least 3 abilities and some passives before you do try and heal a PvE dungeon. Using this in the open world as you level is an absolute must. The first dungeon is about level 25, so you should at least by that time have the 3 abilities and some passives that you can use with the life staff before trying to heal a dungeon. And let's move on to DPS, the most complicated one. Now, the attribute you focus on here here is entirely dependent on the kind of archetype, I guess we're going to refer to it as, that you choose to play as. I really like what New World is doing from a DPS perspective, and if they nail it, it can be very fun. Deciding your weapon for a DPS will also affect what primary stat you should focus on. So basically the way to break this down is that if you look at your attributes, you can see which weapon scales with which attribute. So you should pick 2 weapons from one of these lines, and that should be the ones you'll focus on. There's really 3 main archetypes, I would say, roughly. It's hard to gauge because, you know, we haven't even had the full game come out. This may change, etc., etc. But really, there's 3 types, and we'll go through each of them individually. The first is melee, and for a melee build, you should focus on either strength or dexterity, depending on the weapons that you choose. Most melee weapons scale with strength, though some do scale with dexterity separately to strength. I would suggest possibly to try the hatchet and the great axe as your 2 weapons, as it's the most common combo that I have seen. The hatchet has some really great damage and self-sustain abilities, and the great axe has some really high damage single hit potential with abilities like execute. You can really use whatever you like though, like you can use the hammer, the spear, anything really, and as long as you're focusing on strength and dexterity and making sure you're using the scaling properly, then you will succeed in melee. For range, there is the musket or the bow. The bow only scales with dexterity, while the musket scales with dexterity and intelligence. I've seen some really good dexterity builds focusing on the musket and the spear as the combo, as they are both dexterity based. The musket will really deal a lot of damage from range. When they get close, you can start stabbing them with your spear. Without really having tested this myself, I have a feeling that a build like this would succeed very well in PvP combat because you've got a really solid range damage option as well as a close range options with the spear and the musket. As a mage DPS, there is really 2 main options, being the fire staff and the ice gauntlet. You could try to make the life staff work. I would really be interested to see if it is possible, though all of its abilities are healing and protective based, so I don't think it would be. But primarily as a mage, you're going to be a range DPS focusing on the intelligence attribute. Now, something you could pair with if you did want to try melee is the rapier, as it does scale with intelligence and dexterity. So you could have something as the fire staff as your primary weapon, and then the rapier as your secondary, similar to that archetype with a ranged dexterity build being the musket and the spear. There is a lot of good options with the fire and the ice staff, and they all do different kinds of damage to enemies, which is something to really be looking out for if you are focusing on these lines, so that you can make sure you're maximizing the resistances on enemies. Regardless of whether you choose to be a ranged, a melee, or a mage, or a combination of both, you should be playing around with the weapon masteries in your early levels. Test out every weapon that you get, see if you like it, get some abilities with it, and just have a bit of a play around, especially while you're still early in the game, so you can try and see what you like to play as. I think there's a lot of flexibility in the weapons that you can use, and realistically at any point you can just pick up a different weapon and decide that, you know, maybe you were a hatchet user and now you're going to be a great axe user or something. You know, you can just choose to level those weapons separately, and there is no downside to that. You can respec for free up to level 20, so if you are going to respec, make sure you do that with your attributes. But after that, it does have a little bit of gold cost. It's not much, but you know, just as a bit of a warning, it does cost. Same with your weapon masteries. Once you get to 11 in a particular weapon mastery, it will cost a soth in order to respec that line. So before you get to that point, when you're about the 9-10 range, you should play around with respecing, trying all the different abilities in that line and seeing what works for you, as well as the passives. There is some significant benefits to using the passives in all of the different weapon lines. They will make your builds pretty much come together, in what I found while I've been tanking dungeons. One other thing to note is that in the weapon masteries, there is one-handed and two-handed and ranged and magic. Really, the one-handed and two-handed lines don't matter. They do affect the weapon speed a little bit. One-handed is a little bit faster, two-handed is obviously a little bit slower, but realistically, it doesn't matter. You can only use a shield with the sword. If you were thinking that maybe you could hatchet and shield or something like that, you can't. It's only one-handed, shield, and sword. They're the only lines that will actually match with the shield. So if you aren't using a sword and shield, you should not have a shield equipped. And the final tip is to go watch my New World tips video that goes through 25 tips to get you ready for the New World launch that is coming up in just under a month's time. Please follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and on Twitch, where I stream 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, Australian night times. Hope to see you guys there in the next stream. Thank you for watching this video. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.